Welcome, everyone. Happy New Year. I am ready for an extremely optimistic 2021, and I'm really glad you are here with us for our event today. My name is Mel Ochoa with Landmark Ventures, which produces the Social Innovation Summit. The Social Innovation Summit is a platform designed to elevate groundbreaking ideas and innovative leaders who are changing the world for the better. Our global flagship summit will take place virtually this year, June 8th, 9th, and 10th. So make sure you go to socialinnovation.com to register for that. But today, we are excited to kick off our 2021 year-round event series alongside our great partners, AARP. Beginning last May, as the scale and impact of the pandemic came into focus, AARP teamed up with SIS on a slate of digital conversations to talk with industry leaders and experts about issues that impact longer and healthier lives for all communities. Conversations that elevate the national dialogue around equitable longevity outcomes. Today, we'll continue that conversation, reimagining a future that ensures that all people have an equal opportunity to make the most of a longer and healthier life. I was on a call with the panel a few days ago, and what interested me is their focus less on a deficit mindset for 2020, but on an asset-based mindset in looking at what's right and how we can use what we've learned in adversity to improve our communities going forward. We sent all attendees a digital brochure with the agenda for today. We are taking questions from the audience that our speakers will answer toward the end of the discussion. Please submit your questions for our speakers through the Zoom Q&A function throughout the event. I am pleased to kick off today's event and introduce the Senior Vice President of Global Thought Leadership at AARP, Jean Axius. Hi, Jean. Happy New Year. Good to see you.
It's good to see you. Well, thank you so much for that introduction. We are extremely excited to continue our partnership to really explore and examine the solutions, as you indicated in your opening remarks, that would really help us not just reimagine, but rebuild our systems and rebuild our societies in a more inclusive manner that allows everyone the opportunity to live a longer, healthier, and more productive life. I'm extremely honored to be serving as the Senior Vice President for Global Thought Leadership at AARP. I'm even more honored to be working with some of the most talented, brilliant minds on my team, who you will actually get a chance to engage with throughout our series this year around these issues, and more importantly, the solutions that we need in order to create a more inclusive economy and a more inclusive society. As we know, this pandemic, as well as the series of crises that has resulted, whether it's the millions of people who've been infected by COVID-19, the thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who have actually lost their lives to COVID-19, the economic crisis and the racial unrest has really shed extreme light on the fragile systems we have and the opportunities for us to reimagine and think anew. These solutions that we have before us and these opportunities that we have before us to amplify ideas that will help build our societies in a much more stronger way moving forward will require a multi-pronged, a multi-sectorial approach that involves the role for public, private, and nonprofit sectors. And in fact, we're actually starting to see some of that take shape. Whether it's the recent announcement back in December of last year, where several leading companies have joined forces to create opportunities for Black workers, or more recently, the announcements that we've seen over the last couple of days with the new administration signing new executive orders to advance racial equity. We really do have an opportunity to address many of these systemic issues in a way that really ensures that we are all prospering as a society. According to the Kellogg Foundation in Autumn, they had a report that illustrated that advancing equity is critically important for economic well-being. In fact, to the extent to which we could close the opportunity gap, we would actually see an additional $8 trillion in increase in terms of GDP. So I am looking forward to the conversation today. We have four brilliant thought leaders and influencers who's going to explore some of the challenges, but also some of the opportunities before us. And how can we really think about that more inclusive society and create a more peaceful society for all of us? With that, I am excited to introduce Bahia Robinson, who's going to take over and lead our conversation. Bahia?
Hi, all. I am Bahia Yasmin Robinson, CEO and founder of VC Include. I am so excited to have this conversation today. So just a little bit about my background so it all makes sense. I'm CEO and founder of VC Include, which is a platform and multiple programs that support women and diverse-led fund managers. So I really work in kind of the inclusion and finance space. But really my work centers around innovation, equity, and abundance. And that's really the core of the work that I'm doing. And, part of that is around generational wealth, around legacy building, around bridge building. And these are all themes that the panelists with me today are experts at. And so I'm very excited to kind of dig into their insights. So we'll be having a conversation around storytelling and solution sets around how to build a more inclusive America, a more healthy America, and a thriving America. And so with that, I'm going to ask the panelists a number of questions. Oh, and before I start, before we kind of go off, please put your questions in the Q&A as we're talking, and we'll be sure to address some of them at the end of about 25 minutes or so. So without further ado, I really want to start with Dr. Woodson. You are the elder, the wise woman here, and we want to honor you. And also just take a temperature check. How are you? You're a geriatrician, you're a doctor that works with other elderly patients. And I'm sure you have a lot of data and insights to share. But from an empathetic perspective, how are you doing? How are your patients doing? And what's your and how do you feel like the elderly generation is doing? I mean, obviously you can't talk for everyone, but you have your finger on the pulse. So we want to do a temperature check with you around your work and you personally, and just get a deeper sense as to, kind of what's going on.
I am doing outstanding. And there are two sectors here of the way older adults are handling this pandemic. First of all, there are people who are extremely resilient because this is not the first time they've been through adversity. This is not the first set of protests that they've seen.
Right.
And they've overcome so many obstacles in their lives, and they can look back over that, realize they're the same people that they were who handled that stuff, and say, okay, what's plan B? That's one half. The other half are seniors who are very isolated and who are very rigid. And the way that we are maintaining our socialization here is primarily through digital means. And so a lot of those seniors who do not have access really need to be encouraged to be more involved in the technology. I have a 94-year-old aunt who was working 3 days a week before the pandemic, but she is not into tech. We set up her Facebook page. We set up her portal, shipped it to Philadelphia, and had somebody there talk her through hooking it up to her internet. And now we can talk to her. So I think that isolation can be overcome with some intergenerational work. I mean, the younger generation has not seen problems like this. Our generation has. So we can talk to them about resilience and about, trouble don't last always, this too shall pass, that kind of thing. And then the younger folks who are more tech savvy can help those of the older adults who aren't quite ready to jump into the digital world. And that will be great for everybody.
Wonderful, beautiful. I'm glad that you're doing well. Some of the solutions that you suggested, I'm working with with my mom. I hope she made it onto Zoom. Hi, Mom. She's having some tech issues. Well, wonderful. I wanted to move this to Sean because I heard something that resonated with me is that you said that your mom had said right kind of before the pandemic really hit that we're experiencing a fault line in humanity, which really struck me, and back to the kind of wisdom piece. How are we experiencing that fault line? Please give us some of your background and experience with your work, not just with Black male achievement, but even with My Brother's Keeper and kind of other things that, as you talk about sunsetting,
paid for Black male achievement, yeah.
Yes, thank you. And moving into the larger work, how can we create this new timeline is really what I wanted you to dig into.
Wow, and thanks for bringing my mom into the conversation. You did your homework really well, but for the audience, I remember it was like the first week of March of last year, and I was planning to, my mother is in Florida, retired in Century Village, and she was celebrating her 80th birthday last April, and I was having a conversation with her and saying, this is right on the precipice before the shutdown. I'm looking forward to visiting you. And she was like, I don't think you're coming. I think that this pandemic is going to shut everything down. And she said to me, she said, Sean, I think that this is a fault line in humanity. And I thought my mother was being dramatic, as she tends to be sometimes, but she wasn't being dramatic. She was really being prophetic, right? And what we saw in 2020 was a once in a century global health pandemic. But that coalesced with a 400 year, a 4th century pandemic of racial oppression, white supremacy. And my background has intersected through youth development, community building, racial justice. I've been blessed in the last 12 years to lead the campaign for Black male achievement and really be a catalyst for connecting leaders, multi-race, multi-gender leaders to advance Black male achievement in this nation. And as we are having this conversation, you know, one of the epiphanies that I have had is that, and particularly May 25th, the world was able to see George Floyd be murdered on national TV. And I liken the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many during last year's 2020 to what we saw in 1955 with the death and murder of Emmett Till, and how that ignited a civil rights movement. And I want to thank Black women. We saw an acceleration of Black women in 2020, and the spirit of Mamie Till, who said, I am going to show the world what racism and hate did to my son with an open casket. Darnella Frazier did the same thing, standing on that curb and filming the horrific, brutal murder of George Floyd. And as we talk about building equity, and I really appreciate AARP and the Social Innovation Summit for having this conversation. What I found in my work is that we have to be very mindful of not putting racial equity icing on a cake that's been built with hate, fear, racial injustice, right? And so as we have these conversations, as we write executive orders, how do we really dismantle the structural racism? The healing is going to take a revealing. And so I am both balancing optimism and wow, this is a discouragement, right? And how do I lean on my optimistic side?
Absolutely, absolutely. And AARP, welcome to the conversation. So excited to have you. And I wanted you to be kind of the one that pulls it together, particularly on the young people's side. Well, you're the bridge builder, right? And you're the person that brings conversations and diplomacy to life. And so I want you to talk a little bit about your background, and then also, you know, you've talked a lot about the new generation, or the younger generation, I should say, you know, not being left out of this intergenerational conversation, and how, you know, a lot of the insecurities that they have because they haven't experienced, you know, those, you know, first 30-year, you know, times in their life, as Dr. Woodson, you know, expresses, like they're kind of coming into this like, wait, what? What's going on? Talk a little bit about your work, please, also on the interfaith piece, but also on the your insights around the new generation and what's needed there from a solution set.
Sure. Thank you, Bahia and Dr. Woodson and Sean. It's really a pleasure to be with both of you. And you've already inspired me just with your first responses. I am a second generation child of Indian immigrants, born, raised, and educated in Chicago. Spent some time in DC, and I'm now back in Chicago. And I'm a Muslim American, I'm an Indian American, so I have all the hyphens. So I think, Bahia, my life in many ways has been around bridge building. I don't know how I feel about the term building. I'm still trying to find a better word for what that means, because it's just and not the other. And, you know, but anyway, I sit at the intersection, I think, of many different identities. And I think you nailed it when you kind of said you're trying to balance the optimistic with maybe the realistic. And if 2020 and 2021 has been marked by anything for me, it is introspection about this moment that we sit in, and all of the kind of news and outreach about the vaccine. I've been thinking a lot about how will we look at this moment retrospectively. Another place where I sit in the middle is I'm part of the sandwich generation. So I have a 5-year-old and I have elderly aging parents who increasingly have needs. Some of which have been deep loneliness and isolation in the past year. Even though my parents have one another, they're used to being in the world. And so trying to kind of think about how you balance all of those, but really like, what is a story we will tell of this time? What is a story I will tell of this time to my daughter? And how that these inflection points that Sean described, which are so painful, but actually aspirationally, hopefully led us to something better and bigger, because it caused us to get out of our comfort zone and aspire to something collective. And so I think about there's just this, you know, the notion of e pluribus unum, out of many one. And it doesn't really feel like we're out of many one. It feels like we're out of many, many. And so what does that mean? And like, what is the true character of this country about who we are? And the one thing I keep coming back to again and again, and Dr. Woodson mentioned this as well, is resilience. Yeah. And the idea that we as people are resilient people, and that resilience has been most powerfully demonstrated by Black communities across America over and over again. And I always have like, I'll turn my head that verse by Langston Hughes, in which he says, "Oh yes, I say it plain, America was never America to me, and yet I swear this oath, America will be." And last week, or, you know, 2021 has not been uneventful either, right? And so just the way we felt on January 6th versus being reminded on the inauguration again by a self-described skinny Black girl, descended from slaves, raised by a single mother, that person, that girl, that woman, Amanda Gorman, remind us of our calling and who we should aspire to be. And so I think, you know, we want this to be an asset-based conversation, and we look at this aspirational narrative that we've lost, you know, and the sense of kind of collective grief too, of how are we going to deal collectively with what over 300,000 deaths in this country in 1 year. You know, we haven't even thought about, I think, the manifestations of those things. So I focus a lot on just the social aspect of well-being and what that means. And I think the domain that I live in is civil society. It's not government. It's not private sector. It's us. It's every single one of us. And the story of progress in this country is the story of individuals, you know, showing up every single day.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to cue Sean around his comments about social justice being self-care. But before we get to that, I'd really love to engage Dr. Woodson around trauma. And so, you know, as Anat talks about, you know, where we are, I wanted to get that palpable kind of round table of what we're feeling and where we are. And there's obviously a lot of trauma embedded, right? Trauma from past, trauma now that we're in these kind of environments where some feel isolation. You know, we're relying on our resilience in a lot of ways, right? We're relying, like we're like, I'm resilient, but I'm resilient. You know, we're trying to kind of stay in that place, and some of us can do that better than others. Do you have any thoughts or even tips around how we address kind of trauma and healing in this time? You know, as an expert, what do you suggest? You know, when folks come to you and say, we're really, you know, we're having a hard time here.
Well, first I want to say that the hard times have not happened yet. You know, people are running so fast it hasn't caught them yet. When this is over is when you're going to see the PTSD in our healthcare workers. Because while you're in the midst of doing it, you can't stop to think about what you're doing. So I think we need to set up systems of talking about that it's okay. Nobody's trying to be, you know, we're not deputy God here. You know, we're not supposed to be the ones in charge, the ones who are so strong. We have to say that grieving is not a character flaw. And that's something we're going to need to look at in the future. But I think where we are now is, again, it's twofold. There are people who were alive when Emmett Till sparked that civil rights movement. people who are sort of not happy that people discovered all of a sudden that this is happening when it's not something that's new. So there are people who are sort of warily optimistic. We've had our hopes build up before, and although this feels different to me, it feels different because there's everybody now involved, young, old, all different colors, all different cultures are out there talking about it. It feels different, but many of us are just not ready to buy that. So I think what we need to do is help people see that whatever it is, you've already been through. I mean, my father died 2 weeks after I started medical school. If that didn't break me, a mask is going to break me. It's like, so we need to connect people to what they've already been through, that we can do this. We can. And those of us who are very resilient and very optimistic and we're going to get this done, there's also the people who worship sameness. And that is very scary because it's never going back the way it was, never. So we're talking about not bouncing back, but bouncing forward. And so it's a question of how those of us who have that resilience and that forward power are going to engage those of us who maybe need some more support.
Absolutely. And so as we kind of expand our view, right, it's important to take a snapshot of where we are. There's no policy, there's no public-private partnerships without individual experience, right? So that's part of our job is to communicate those things. But as we look to systems change and, systems, public-private sector playing a role in the support system that we will all need both now, that we need now, but also that we need in the future. What are your thoughts here? I mean, how are you seeing public-private partnerships play a role in some of the solutions or some of the support systems for communities, communities of color? Someone mentioned it's not about young and old. We are looking at a spectrum of age, right? But we have our individual experiences at wherever point we're at. And so how do you see that a little bit more broadly? And Zanat, maybe you want to jump in from the Aspen Institute perspective, because I know you guys collect a lot of data and metrics around and also do a lot of public-private policy work.
Yeah. I mean, I think it is obvious that the scale of any problem, we're talking about the pandemic, the scourge of racism, the global problems we have around climate change, gender equality, nothing can happen without multi-stakeholder partnerships. And I hope, and I'll say I think I agree with Dr. Woodson, we're not out of the woods. We have no idea what this is going to actually look like socially, economically, politically, for a long time to come probably. But I hope that we are looking at the idea of public partnerships with a different point of view, and one that centers those who have deep amounts of social trust in our communities. And so when I was saying kind of the story of change in this country, positive, just a micro story of individuals, it's neighbors helping neighbors, which we did see during the pandemic. It's people stepping up. It's churches and houses of mosques and gurdwaras feeding people and also stepping up in ways that they can, that we think about how to scale those. And that starts with identifying the leaders that are in communities better, and then understanding that if you sit in the public sector in a policy position, if you sit in the private sector, you're operating from a place of privilege. And so how do we close the gap between the leaders and the change makers who are making that change and the people who have resources and connections in society? So people like the Aspen Institute. And how do you not, and I don't like the language of let's make sure all stakeholders are at the table, because you can't set the table and then invite somebody as your guest, right? We have to create that table together. So I think those are just very nascent starting points that we have to change the way we think about partnerships.
Yeah.
Dr. Woodson.
Dr. Woodson, yeah.
I think that our partnerships need to be a little more diverse. I mean, we talk about the church and houses of worship, but I'm talking about putting information in barbershops, in nail shops, in hair salons, in libraries, in grocery stores, where people actually are, meeting them where they are, and not just looking for leaders, because there's a leader on every block. There's somebody in every block who's the go-to person. We may never find those folks, but we need to be able to give information, be present where people are.
This is a notion of the power of positive deviance that really lifts up the truth that the solution to the world's most intractable problems already lies in the heads, the hands, and the hearts of the individuals and the communities that sometimes we of privilege, right? And we all have our own privilege, paratroop into communities with prescriptions. And I'm wondering, how do we scale empathy, compassion, and trust the individuals and communities, the leaders, not that the leaders that we designate, to help us with the solutions and with the answers. And as Zanat said earlier, not build a table and invite them, right? How do we be inclusive in that way? That's what I'm thinking about. And I think about this conversation, and I think of the mission of AARP, and I think of COVID-19, and specifically the impact it has had on Black and Brown communities, and particularly Black men. And ProPublica just recently published an article that talked about the hallowing of a whole generation of young Black men. Just 2 days ago, 48-year-old Sekou Smith, a Turner Sports broadcaster covering the NBA, 48 years old, and died of COVID-19. And we have to go upstream. And in this article, it talked about this whole notion of John Henryism and how we as Black people, we've all heard it. We got to work harder, do better, and just push, push, push. And for so many of us, we feel we don't have the luxury of longevity, right? That we have the shortest life expectancies. And so, yes, it starts with individuals. How do I stay healthy? And what the pandemic did was reveal the health inequities and the underlying conditions, right? And so it revealed a lot of work that needs to be done. And when we talk about grieving, this generational grief, right? And we were grieving as a people. We went into 2020 coming off of 2019, a year of return, and acknowledging 400 years of slavery, right? And I am just, the work that we have ahead of you, and I agree, Dr. Woodson, there's we have not seen the worst, right? That there is much ahead of us, but how do we elevate radical empathy? And I had an opportunity to be in conversation earlier this week with Isabel Wilkinson, the author of Caste. And she used the metaphor of this country really being bipolar, right? And being created and found in these ideals of liberty and justice and everyone created equal, but not in practice. And until we as a nation, and particularly those that have been in power, and white supremacists and white folks, privileged people, really pull the skin back from that history of the reality of this nation, it's going to be hard to go forward. So how do we do that and build at the same time together?
I love your idea of scaling empathy, compassion, and trust. I would add to that scaling self-awareness, right? Because again, it starts with the individual,
yes,
where you can even build those things, or at least recognize those things in yourself and others. And so I'm wondering, just to dig a little more, because I'm taking a quick look at the Q&A. Some of those we'll get to in more like in a more direct way. But as we look at kind of policy, public sector, private sector, right, and kind of solution making, we have this new administration. Obviously, in the last couple of weeks, there's been a much more public kind of discussion, but also precedent setting around social justice, economic justice, et cetera. Do you guys feel, and are there specific examples of policy that is driving either public sector or private sector solution making? I mean, obviously there's, outside of the headlines, right? Outside of kind of what we see on the front cover of major newspapers, do you have any insights there of where policy is kind of working to create more engagement, resilient communities, and even infrastructure of support for what's coming for what's coming, what's ahead? And anyone can jump in there if you have some either examples or even some optimism, even if it's not, I know this is happening. Obviously, we have a new administration, but there seems like there's a desire to kind of drive both public and private sector solution making. And I wonder if you have any examples of that.
Well, I
Yes,
can
Dr.
talk
Woodson.
about opportunities that I'm not hearing people talk about, things that we need
Fantastic.
solutions for. You know, the Black and brown communities and the older communities are more likely to die from this pandemic because of underlying disease. But the question is, why is there so much underlying disease in our communities? Well, there's food deserts and there's malnutrition. You know, carbs and salt and fat are very cheap and you can get a lot of them compared to fresh vegetables. And so there are opportunities. You're seeing all of these companies come up providing fresh vegetables that might be a different shape than what they want to put in the grocery stores, but are still nutritious. We need to do more with getting information about how to eat healthy and how to move around. I mean, some people don't live in communities where they're going to feel comfortable jogging around the block, you know, but we have to get people moving. The little low maintenance things that we can do that aren't expensive, that we know make a difference in these underlying conditions. I think there's lots of opportunity for collaboration between public and private sector and communities around those issues.
And you're not seeing any kind of private or public sector initiatives that are driving those solutions?
There are more and more companies. I mean, you're seeing ads for them, people trying to get these, I don't remember the name of some of them, sort of like bruised vegetables, you know, trying to get things that otherwise would have gone to waste out in the community. So it's beginning. I think we need to amplify that and get that information out to the barbershops. So the people know where they can get nutritious food.
And to your point, I mean, I do see your example about, you know, not throwing away like, you know, non-perfect food, which sounds nuts, but that's kind of how the groceries have set up, and actually utilizing that food because people are, you know, need to eat, right? There's also some barbershop initiatives that I know that are like around kind of policy and you know, policy solutions and kind of discussions. So I know that, to your point, some of these things are starting or have just started just in the last couple of years, not, you know, not over the last decade or so. But Sean or Zanat, are you know, plugged into any of those type of public or private sector initiatives that you want to highlight that are really, you know, doing great work on the ground in some of these ways around the solutions?
So, you know,
Yeah.
go ahead,
Go ahead, John. No, you go ahead.
You had mentioned the barbershops, and that struck my chord. One of our partners, Lorenzo Lewis, has something called the Confess Project, where he has taken mental health services and awareness into barbershops and demystifying for you know, for men, for Black men accessing mental health services. And I think policy certainly around affordable health care, housing, and what we are seeing around returning citizens, you know, being released from our prisons. And we know disproportionately Black and brown individuals are in our prisons. And I think what we have to be really mindful of is not so much the policy change, but the implementation and the legislation, right? And when we look back to go forward, right? And, you know, we just celebrated Dr. King's birthday, and his last book, Where Do We Go From Here? A Community of Chaos. He writes in there that American cities across the nation felt like the legislation that came out of the civil rights movement was not enacted. Right, and there was a sense of disillusionment, and there's a sense of anger, and so I think it's going to be really important when we talk about policy and legislation that we have a level of accountability that is both an inside game and an outside game, where the grassroots activists and folks that we may not want to invite to the tables that we build, that they are also included, right, and so. I do think, and we mentioned the executive orders that were written, right? Just the other day, it's a source of optimism. the inaugural speech, I think was the first time a sitting president that was beginning to sit ever said white supremacy and lifted that up. So I am optimistic around that, right?
And Zanat, speaking to, how do you repair and rebuild? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I think as I think about, Dr. Woodson and Sean both kind of talked about the kinetic energy in the grassroots, right, the bottom up. But when you think about the top down and what is the opportunity, I think it's just that right now with this new administration. I think there's an opportunity. I think you have a posture towards wanting to address racial equity, even, which would have maybe been, something difficult to get strong support for in a previous Democratic administration, that the time is now. But I think that it is just an opportunity, and it kind of needs to be filled with the knowledge of how to do it, right? There is no roadmap. If it was easy, it's something that this country would have reckoned with and figured out, 200 years ago, and we didn't. And so I think again, having kind of voices from all over and having a humility, from policymakers that we don't have the answers, and we're not going to just find them in the Beltway, that we actually need to go to our, to the citizens of this country and listen. And I've seen some sign and signal of that things will not be business as usual, and decisions happen behind closed doors, but rather that having outreach to actually make meaningful change is important. And then I think on the private sector, you had this just the horrific murder of George Floyd, broadcasted across screens around the country, and Breonna Taylor and so many others. And what happened in the private sector, which tends to be, I think, sometimes an early adopter in change, is almost every institution or organization now has to have a DEI strategy. And be shamed if you don't, and that there's more of a cost if for saying things that are not kind of in line with what that looks like. And so I think in a way there's an opportunity there as well, where, to work together to kind of think about that. Even every company has their own self-interest, and I understand that, certainly, but that this work is all, we had to have it yesterday, right? But, hopefully the pandemic has also taught us that change is slow, that slowing down and actually thinking through the way to do this meaningfully, as Sean has said, with measurable outcomes. So it's not, performative allyship, but actually resourced. And that you don't just put, and I think the flag, when I think about that, is what I see over and over is, the Black and brown people within those institutions having to do the work of bringing that institution, with it. And I think just the impact of that is something that's just not even thought about or talked about, but it's heavy, and it takes its toll on social emotional health.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to jump in because some of the questions are again relevant to this thread. And so Linda Slaughter, thank you for this question, is asking, how do we encourage people to acknowledge where the nation is in terms of race relations and desire positive, equitable change? And then she says, in the white community, there are those who don't want to change. And some are just recognizing, after George Floyd in particular, the need for change. How do we keep the issue of race from being put on the back burner when there are so many issues to address at this point in time? So that's kind of another layer to the question.
I think there's a policy pain point there, right? I think the start is, really knowing our history as a nation and what, Black people have experienced in this nation, and a policy of how are we teaching that history in schools across the nation, and schools no matter where, whether it's in white suburban school districts or in communities of color. I think that is a start. I think the other is acting with both a sense of urgency, and these conversations happen and are effective in small scenarios. We saw the big marches of the civil rights movement, but it was the work that happened in coffee counters and church basements. And I think those conversations happened there. And the self-awareness, someone mentioned, I think it was Zanat earlier, about the importance of self-awareness. I think as a country, we are very good at looking out the window, but not so good at looking in the mirror. Right. And how we hold up and say, yes, this is America, and hold up that mirror and see it, and don't do it in a way where, okay, we're blaming, shaming, but listen, this is the truth. I think that's a start.
I think the other start, I'm sorry.
No, please go ahead.
Is to engage these people because they are afraid. You said something about the white community now being afraid. And it's something that Jean said in the introduction, that inequity decreases the GDP. So it actually hurts everyone.
Yeah.
So we need to show that there's no us and them, there's we. This needs to get fixed because everybody is at risk. It may be us today, it ain't gonna be us tomorrow. It could be you tomorrow.
Yeah, no, I was going to say exactly that, which is it, we are each other's keepers. Like, what does that mean? Like, we are in it together, right? So like, I mean, whether we like it or not, we're in this country together. And so how do we reconcile and grapple with that? And also, like, who should we be to one another? Like, how do we have relationship with one another? Because you can't actually say that, I'm only going to talk to people who agree with my political views, who are my religion, who are my faith and ethnicity. Like, it doesn't really work. And so I think if those in the white community who do want change, like, listen to movement leaders, sit close to people who are proximate to the problems, and then it's also uncomfortable. Like, sit with that discomfort. I don't think we're good at it. Sean, as you said, I agree with you. I think we just kind of want to glide over the ugly and then just focus on the pretty, like the city on the hill and e pluribus unum. But until we actually grapple with how we came to this country, the history of slavery, like it's a scourge for white people as well, not just for the communities who have been generationally impacted.
It starts in the coffee rooms and the boardrooms, that when you hear something that is not right, you need to be able to speak it. You need to be able to say why that is a problem for you, that thought. And also for the ones who feel disenfranchised and are at risk of being sucked into this right extremist violence, to point out to them that their value is more than just being white. You don't have to defend, I'm white. There's other value that you have, just like my value is not determined by my skin color, neither is yours, So we need to really be willing to talk to people who, as Zanat said, aren't going to understand us, aren't going to agree with us. Without having a chip on our shoulder, this just is. It's not your fault today. It's not my fault, but it is. We're both here today. So how are we going to do this?
The other thing I wanted to add to that is, and Rashad Robinson from Color of Change talks about this a lot, that folks need to understand and believe that there are consequences for violence against Black people, racial injustice. If you believe that there are no consequences, right? And if a police officer can have his knee on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and like it's no big deal, this sense of we're immune to consequences. If I can storm the Capitol and take selfies and take pictures, I believe there's nothing that can happen to me, that there are no consequences. And so I think that we need to be able to elevate the consequences of the violence, racial prejudice, and really stick to that. Until we begin to do that, folks are going to say, I can keep doing what I've always been doing.
And I think that is, a lot of questions around kind of policy and high level. That is kind of so there's the questions around policy and change and partnership, and then there are the questions around, how can we eradicate racism? I'm saying in the Q&A, which is just, we're talking kind of around it and through it, but there's no, exact, we don't have the solution for that. Otherwise we'd be living in a different world. But You know, I think policy, to your point about, you know, policy and the government is supposed to give us a framework, right? And give us and create some responsibility for our actions. And so I think with this current administration, you know, having policies that are a lot more you know, punitive and hold folks responsible for breaking the rules is something that can be enacted, you know, soon, right? Like it's not a let's wait and see thing. It's a 2021 thing. And so as folks in the audience want kind of solutions, that's one of them, right? Is to give the nation a sense of that's not okay. You will be, you know, punished to the full extent of the law, you know, if you break those laws, right? The laws have been broken, lives have been lost, and there needs to be responsibility taken for that. I have a question that's a little bit more of a larger kind of you know, thoughtful question, which is, if you had a blank check, what would be the first thing you would do, or first organization or initiative you would fund to drive meaningful progress towards equity for each of you? I think that's a good last question, and a broad. Take a minute.
I'll go first, really quickly, and I promise to be short. If I had a blank check, I would take a look at creating a Marshall Plan that started with reparations for African Americans, and something to the level of being able to close the racial wealth gap, increase ownership and business ownership, and create from cradle to career strategies in communities all across the nation, right? And we were able to come up with a few $1 trillion it needed in response to COVID-19. We know that it's there. Let's get a few $1 trillion for reparations for African Americans.
I would add to that, Sean, courses in financial literacy, because somebody can give it to you. If you don't know how to manage it, it won't be there next month. But
Yes.
for me, I would focus on housing. I would focus on the homelessness, and I mean the homeless working people who are in this country. If you don't have a roof over your head, or you're staying in a shelter where you can't leave your stuff, right? You have to take everything with you, and you don't know if they're going to have a space for you tonight. You can't think of anything else.
Yeah.
I would focus on housing. Affordable
I
housing.
would maybe co-sign. I would co-sign on both of those, but I also I think about there's the enormous trust deficit that we have in our country, and look at how I would throw all that money at building civic infrastructure in this country, the spaces and places where we meet, that is not government, that is not private sector. My work right now focuses on equipping faith leaders and faith communities to do that work. Oftentimes it is faith leaders who are doing that work, but just giving kind of operational, you know, gen ops, you know, no holds, like no strings attached funding to those leaders and communities who are making change, who've committed themselves to social change, right, as their bottom line. And they're doing it for all of us. And they don't have time to go raise funds and build relationships with foundations and figure out how to get on the biggest stages. I would just say, you know, I trust your leadership and run with it. And then I want to say one more thing, because I think it's important, is that, you know, oftentimes we're thinking about whether racial reconciliation or intergenerational engagement or any of those things as I'm doing it for you. And I think what this time has really made me feel deeply on, you know, with regard to thinking about longevity in the future, is what a blessing it is to me that I wouldn't have normally slowed down in life. You know, we run through life, I run through life going to events and having this and this and this. And to be able to sit with what an experience of COVID has been, but what it is like for somebody of an elder generation who's not ruffled easily, you know, who's been through this, but who, you know, who is still resilient. That's a blessing for me, not for, you know, my parents or my mother-in-law, like to be able to sit and be with that generation and know that, you know, 40 years, that's going to be me. Like, I don't think we spend a lot of time doing that introspection. If I'm lucky, right? If I'm lucky. And so that has been so deeply humbling. And I hope that, you know, we all take that humility into approaching these really big, scary topics that we're trying to address.
I love that, Zanat. Well, last question about 1 minute for each of you is, what are you optimistic about, and or in a minute, what's your next thing? What is the thing that you're, because of these times, putting out here? And Sean, I'll start with you, but wanna end on a high note here.
So what I'm optimistic about is, one of my mission mantras of realizing that, there's no cavalry coming to save the day in our communities. We are the iconic leaders that we've been waiting for, and the curators of the change that we're seeking to see. And so I'm optimistic about all the amazing talent, young and old, that I see in my daily work, right? And I often say that's how I quantify a hope. And the other part of that question, Bahia, is I am in this intermission season, right? We just sunsetted the campaign for Black male achievement, and really getting clear on what is it mine to do in this season, right? That's elevated, and I know around social justice, racial justice, and I'm coming out with a book in May, and after that, figuring out where I'm going to serve, right? The mission continues, but the mission field is changing for me.
Wonderful. Zanat?
I think very similar. I think there's always kind of a story or a narrative where something happens, right? Like there's an arson of a mosque or a horrific hate crime, and I feel so horrible. And then the morning after, you see the communities rising up in solidarity and forming a chain so that people can safely enter their houses of worship. That American story is what inspires me, right? And that's just everyday people. I mean, I agree with Sean wholly, like having been at the highest levels of government and looking for the people with the answers. Like, we are who we've been waiting for. There are no people with the answers. And so I think I get energy from those movement leaders, and then just the way young people think about these issues is so different. Like, I feel like my calcified brain sometimes can't think as fluidly as they do when they think about the intersection of climate change and equity and all these big problems that they're inheriting from us. That also gives me optimism, just their ability to just wanting to keep pushing for that change.
Wonderful. Last but not least, Dr. Woodson.
I have 2 points. My optimism is my young people, not just the young woman who spoke at the inauguration, but during the protests, reporters were sticking mics in people's faces, and they spoke with eloquence off the top of their heads. They spoke truth off the top of their heads. I was just so proud of my young people. But for my more mature folks, the senior saints, I'm trying to tell you, you are likely to be retired longer than you worked. Let's go. Let's go.
Hello.
Age is not a disease or an excuse for bad behavior. Plan B. Let's go. You're not going to rock on porches. You have wisdom. You have other things that you want to do. It's not about your title or your job description. It's about your skills and your spirit. Let's go.
Amen.
Yes. Thank you all. Thank you so much. I hope this was inspirational to our audience.
Thank you, Bahia.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bahia, Zinat, Sean, and Dr. Woodson for such a forward-looking, thought-provoking, and inspiring conversation, and really a call to action, that call to action to think differently and to really think about the opportunities that we have as leaders, whether it's in our communities, as leaders, whether you are in public, private, or nonprofit sectors, or civil society, to really address the issues and advance a more inclusive a society that benefits all of us. I think that as I heard this conversation and the discussion with our 4 thought leaders today, one of the things that really struck to me was this fundamental question in terms of, are we comfortable with the current status quo? And it's very clear that from the pandemic that we're not, and that we have an opportunity to reimagine, to explore, and to think about the solutions that are really going to help us move forward and move forward collectively. Whether it's in private industry, whether it's in the public sector, or whether it is as individuals. I'm reminded of a quote from Congressman John Lewis, where he talked about that we are the most powerful form of being a change agent. meaning the fact that if we really believe in the change that we seek, then it's easy to commit to doing all we can because the responsibility is ours alone to build a better society that's more inclusive and more peaceful. As I said from the onset of our conversation today, COVID-19 has really rocked us to our core. And as Dr. Woodson indicated in her remarks, the ramifications are still forthcoming. But we have an opportunity, and that opportunity is this great sense of urgency that we're seeing across industries and sectors to really build solutions that are more inclusive in nature. I'm extremely excited that our Build Equity series with the Social Innovation Summit is going to continue, and it's going to continue throughout this entire year. So we have an opportunity to remain connected to all of you and to find and build solutions that will really close the opportunity gaps that have long existed prior to COVID-19. As our AARP founder once said, it has been wisely said that whatever many may say about the future, it is ours. Not only that it may happen to us, but it is part made by us. So with that spirit in mind, I thank you for joining us today. And I hope that you'll continue these conversations and that the solutions that were shared on this webinar, whether it was solutions around resilience, to think about the collective grief that we are encountering as a nation, whether to think about the opportunity to talk to and engage with someone that do not look, think, or act like you. That we have an opportunity to think about non-traditional partners, whether that is the barbershop or the nail salon, and how we actually meet people where they are. And not only meet them where they are, but really co-create solutions that will ensure that we all have an opportunity to live a longer, healthier, and more productive life. So with that, thank you so much for joining us today. Please follow us at Build Equity as our hashtag.